Together, we are here.
Hi, hello.
Hey.
Happy to meet you.
Can you hear me now?
Hi.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
I'm alright.
I don't know how to answer it, but the things are getting very tough.
It's a critical moment of human history.
This pandemic brings to bear the stark realities in which we have lived in for a very long time.
Our current system has facilitated this crisis. This crisis didn't need to be this big.
It's like crumbling and the kind of existing fault lines are being exposed.
The rules are being rewritten.
But who is writing them?
How?
And for whom?
This is a lockdown.
We are on a saddle point, ready to tip in either direction.
It forces us to think about our connections.
It's an opportunity for us to reflect on what are the most important, the vital things in our lives.
To rediscover the sense of community.
The solidarity, togetherness, unity. This is something we've been yearning for.
Together, we hold each other.
We move forward.
Rebuild forwards.
Reimagine forwards.
Organize forwards.
Think forwards.
Teach forwards. Is showing the kind of world that we should build together.
Hello, my name is and for Progressive International with Jeremy. Today's event is to build solidarity with progressives, with people fighting similar struggles as ours, to build solidarity here at home, to build solidarity in a time of crisis. I want to point out that today's event is not a partisan event. There are people joining us who are members of parties, who aren't, who are activists, citizens, people who believe in change. You're showing your commitment to building a better world by being here today. And I want to thank you for your generous contributions to Progressive International through this event. We hope you will consider donating further and into the future to support Progressive International. Year after year, we have seen attacks on the working class and the institutions like the labor movement that have fought for social and economic justice for all. Here in Canada, we've seen attacks on Indigenous peoples and the continuation of genocide. This has all been part of an agenda, a global agenda that has eroded the progress in many cases that has been achieved through struggle and sacrifice. And this past year has proven how the system is broken. The neoliberal agenda of privatization, austerity, job-killing trade deals has proven not only dangerous, but deadly for our elderly, for Indigenous peoples, for workers, and especially racialized and immigrant communities. We cannot afford the status quo. We need a transformative vision for our world, one that seeks to prioritize the well-being of people and our planet above profit. A vision rooted in the power of the collective and collective action. A vision of a world where racial justice, social justice, economic justice, and environmental justice are not slogans, but a reality. A world of peace. To get there, we need a bold vision rooted in principle. And to get there, we need to build solidarity. The challenges of our time are challenges shared by people around the world. The rise of the far right, the rise of inequality, and the threat of the climate emergency. Many in our communities are taking on these struggles, and in response, we must find ways to build solidarity and global movements for change. I also, before want to go on, want to acknowledge the victims of the Atlanta shooting that took place this past week. I want to recognize the 6 women of Asian descent that were killed in Atlanta. This is a horrific reminder of the rise of anti-Asian racism, the rise of white supremacy and misogyny. From our streets to our parliaments, we need to call out this hate. We need to put a stop out to this hate and work in solidarity with communities targeted and those fighting back. And speaking of the fight back, I am tremendously honored today to join with an incredible champion of the people, a champion for justice, a champion for transformative change, somebody who, as member of parliament, as a leader, as an activist, has done everything to push for a better future for his country and for our world. I would like to now take a moment to welcome Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you. Thank you, Niki, for inviting me on. And the introductory video from Progressive International is fantastic because it brings together so much, the individuals, the people, the cause, the principles, and it leaves one with a sense of opportunity to develop hope, because I'm tired of being told by the mainstream media that there is no way but the free market, there is no way but another war, and that racism is just one of those things you have to live with. No, 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 there is a different way. And I hope this afternoon, together, we can explore those different ways with the questions we've got from the audience coming in. But just to say thank you very much for the honor of inviting me onto your call today from Manitoba in Canada, where I'm delighted to learn the temperatures now reach 10 degrees. That fills me with hope, because one of my little habits over the years has been to watch the temperature in Winnipeg every night when it comes up on global weather forecasts. And it's a bit of a sad story, to tell you the truth. When it goes below 0, like in October, I think, wow, I'm going to visit Winnipeg, but I'm not sure what time of the year I'll choose.
We would love to have you in Manitoba, and there's great things to be done, and always great people to see, no matter the year. Jeremy, we are so honored you're joining, and I just want to mention that for so many people tuning in, we are so thrilled. So many of us progressives, people on the left, have been truly inspired by your work, and I think are really inspired by your commitment, not just to change within your own country, but to building a global movement for change. Can you share with us why Progressive International? And of course, you have your own initiative that you launched. Why internationalism?
Well, you can't achieve change in one country on its own. I would have thought that's been pretty clear from 2008, when the global financial crisis took place, that obviously, if you try and do it on your own, it doesn't work, because you've got global forces up against you. And the growing inequalities around the world have been writ large in this pandemic, writ large. If you're poor, if you're black, if you live in a poor country or a poor zone of a rich country, A, you're less likely to get the vaccine. B, you're more likely to get COVID. C, you're more likely to die as a result of it. The World Health Organization warned last January, a pandemic can only be dealt with by universal health care the world over. It's true then, it's true now. And I think the lessons from this have to be that. We have always been internationalists in my wing of the Labour Party and the Labour movement. Before I became the leader of the party, I was the chair of the Stop the War Coalition, and I've been a lifetime member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. I joined when I was 15, and I'm still a member and proud to be so, and will continue to be so. After the last general election, when we didn't get the result we wanted, maybe we can explore that later on, we decided to found the Project for Peace and Justice. You can see the symbol behind me. The symbol is actually quite brilliant because there's no upside down, there's no wrong way round. It can photocopy whatever angle it's from, so it's never wrong, which is a big help when people are
universal,
maybe photocopying things not so well. And you've got the message I gave at the start of my leadership behind me. Things can and they will change. And so our project is, I'll very quickly explain what we're doing. Working in 4 main areas. 1, challenging the power of the mainstream media and the concentration of ownership amongst a small number of people, challenging the news values, uniting people that are operating independent media like we're doing this afternoon, and developing that sense of a global unity about it. And one thing the pandemic has taught us is we can talk to each other globally quite easily. In the past 3 days, I've had substantial conference calls and meetings with people in 3 continents. And that we're doing that sort of thing all the time. Actually, we could have done this before the pandemic, but we've learned better during the pandemic. So we're challenging the media, and we're looking to put on a big event at the Edinburgh Festival in August, when I made what's called the Alternative MacTaggart lecture 3 years ago, which was challenging media ownership controls. Secondly, we're looking at issues of economic injustice in Britain, the way in which small businesses are being driven to the wall, the way in which big business is taken over on our high streets, and the way in which the big companies are trying to fire and then rehire their workforce on lower wages, on worse working conditions. The strength of unions is important. So we're organising at a grassroots level through community organising to gain union recognition, to support people and to fight back, as well as the big global issues. And I noticed, I'm very pleased you had my great friend John McDonnell in the initial video, along with Yanis Varoufakis, both of whom are very committed to a global alternative, which is about investment for the future. 2 other quick areas. I don't want to go on too long because we've got to take questions. The third is the Green New Deal, environmental justice. And now we can't go on ignoring it. It is happening before our very eyes. It is quite possible to reach net zero by 2030, 9 years' time. It does require dramatic changes. But when we developed our Green Industrial Revolution strategy over the past 5 years in the Labour Party, a number of us in a table in my office went around it. And a very important message was given to me by Rebecca Long Bailey, MP for Salford in the northwest of England, near Manchester, although they won't like that reference because they see themselves as different from Manchester, but that's okay. Becky said, Jeremy, whatever we do has got to be something that my constituents can relate to, and an appeal to them will work. That means it's got to be something that's reasonable for people working in manufacturing industry, reasonable for people that are quite frightened of what the future might bring and can't afford to buy organic macrobiotic food. They're hard up and they're buying in the supermarkets. It's got to change. And so the whole principles behind our green industrial revolution are protect the jobs, invest for the future, and create green energy and green development. And that means you've got to guarantee people minimum income, as well as all the other things that we can and have to do. And as one who had the pleasure of growing up in the countryside in the English Midlands, I joy and glory at biodiversity, at bees and ants and beetles and frogs and all the rest of it. Because I love the countryside. I love what goes with it. It's not just for enjoyment. We need it. You can't live without it. And so the protection of natural spaces and biodiversity, to me, is central to all of this. And that means agricultural changes, and it means recognizing overproduction leads to soil degradation, so on. Okay, so we're very determined on the green industrial revolution. And the last area is international justice. I mentioned that I came into all this through the peace movement, through opposition to the Iraq war. And this week, Boris Johnson, who's, has an interesting train of thought, decides that in very short order, we will privatize large areas of the health service, hand out massive contracts to big business to not deliver track and trace systems, and we will cut our overseas aid budget, which we managed to get up to the 0.7%, which is what it minimum that it should be. We managed to cut
beyond
that.
Canada's, yeah.
And then absolutely, and then he proposes now a big increase in defense expenditure and a 40% increase in the number of nuclear warheads we've got.
Yeah.
This isn't making the world more secure. This is making the world much more dangerous and at risk. And so a peace agenda says, ask ourselves the question, what is security? What is real security? Real security, you have somewhere to live, you have food to eat, your kids go to school, you got the doctor in the hospital when you need it, and you breathe clean air, and you have some prospects of living to an old age when you will get a decent pension when you retire from your work. Surely that is what real security is about. What we have is massive insecurity because of global inequality, 70 million people forced to be refugees, global inequality in environment, in work, and so much else. Free market economics isn't going to solve the environment crisis, isn't going to solve the work crisis, isn't going to solve the happiness issues that people face. It's only collective action. That's what Progressive International is about. That's what we're about. That's what you're about. And you know what? There's an awful lot of us that think the same way. And when we start working together, we're very strong.
Absolutely. And you give us much strength, Jeremy. And, this is only the beginning, and I know so many people are excited to support your work in.
By the way, what's the painting behind you?
Oh, this is a it was gifted to me. It's by a First Nations artist. It was gifted to me by Chief Doreen Spence of the Tatasqueyak Cree Nation as a thanks when I stood with her First Nation in opposition to our hydro corporation's insistence on continuing to operate the work camp during COVID-19, when the First Nation had asked for it to be put on temporary shutdown to protect their members and the workers. And it was an instance of solidarity. They had been threatened by the police with an injunction. They had taken legal action, the corporation had. And I will add, it's a publicly owned corporation, but we have a conservative government, and certainly its political direction is very troubling. And so, but the stand that we took was effective. It did lead to a temporary shutdown. It did help keep our region safe. And so I have this painting. Thank you for asking.
Can you thank Chief Doreen for it? It's beautiful. I really like it.
I will absolutely thank her, and we'll see if we can ask the artist to perhaps to make one for you, since you have taken so many like-minded stands, Jeremy. And speaking of First Nations, I did want to go to our first question, Jeremy, from a good friend, Amy Jackson, on a topic that I think that you've got something to share as well.
Danson Sinigas and Amy. I'm an Indigenous woman from northern Manitoba, Canada, and I have a question today about imperialism. As an Indigenous woman, I see imperialism as a plague that has horrific consequences for Indigenous people around the world. History has shown us time and time again that imperialism only creates harm. Jeremy Corbyn, you have been an ally in struggles to dismantle empire and decolonize for decades. I believe the left must take a stand against imperialism, both ongoing and historically, in terms of the effects of ongoing colonialism. To you, Jeremy Corbyn, what can and what must the left do to, 1, take on decolonization and make appropriate reparations, and 2, condemn the modern imperialist adaptations in their tracks? Can I ask a minute?
Jeremy,
Niki.
any thoughts?
Yes. First of all, thank you for a brilliant and very profound question, because it leads me to a topic I feel very strongly about. And let's start with where it begins, where attitudes come from. A very good friend of mine, a man called Remy Capo, has written a trilogy of books on the history of the slave trade. They're set both in West Africa, which he describes as Guinea in his books, they're novels, and then in Paraguay, which is basically Jamaica in the Caribbean. And it's also set at the sugar exchange and the stock market in London. This is all set in the 17th century. Absolutely brilliant books. They describe the utter brutality of the slave trade, where people go out as slave hunters in the forests in West Africa, capture people, put them in chains and take them to put in a fort on the coast and then load them onto ships. And before the ship sailed, a priest would go and stand in front of the ship on the dockside and bless it and bless all the people on the ship for their journey. Hundreds of people manacled. Many would die on the journey and many would die when they arrived. And then they would be exploited for the rest of their lives. And it's that brutal history. And then Remy explores issues of how it is that the sailors on those ships, the forces that go on slave hunting expeditions, those that become overseers on the sugar plantations, those that deal in and buy and sell the sugar that comes from it, somehow or other have become immunized to the human suffering that's going on before their very eyes. And that can only have come about because of the denigration of Black people in the history syllabus in Western Europe and other places. So you have this dehumanization of a whole people. But Remy also explores those slaves that had managed to escape, ended up, some of them, not very many, but some of them ended up in London, and how white working class communities in London defended them against bounty hunters who went looking for escaped slaves. So there is a history of a degree of unity on it. So we have to understand where this history comes from. And then when the slave trade ended and slavery theoretically ended, how did it happen? Yes, in Britain, William Wilberforce, a very famous member of parliament, did introduce the legislation which brought about the end of slavery. It's true, he did. But in reality, was he really the cause of the freedom of slaves? Or was it the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, who toured the whole of Britain, showing the accoutrements of slavery, the manacles, the chains, and all the rest of it in village halls all over the country? Or was it something else? Was it that the sugar owners became frightened of the slave uprisings in Western Jamaica around Montego Bay? And Richard Hart, a friend of mine who's sadly deceased, wrote a wonderful book about how blacks escaped bondage because of the uprisings which hit the sugar price and drove some of those sugar dealers out of business. But they extracted their price, a debt and a compensation which was still being paid up to 2015 by the British Exchequer, the equivalent of billions of pounds. So we have to understand the history of the slave trade. Now, I know it's quite a long answer to the first part of your question, but if I can just develop the theme, if that's okay, Niki.
Mm-hmm.
Just
there's a lot to say.
You know, there's a lot to say.
Yeah.
The other points you're saying about indigenous peoples around the world, the denigration of them, the way in which colonists in Chile went hunting the Mapuche people on Chiloé, literally hunting. The way in which tribes, as they're described in the Amazon, were driven to the point of destruction and still are by mining and farming interests. The way in which in Canada, in Australia, particularly, the way in which indigenous languages were banned, prevented from being spoken at all, the way in which people of those communities were then taken into homes, as in Australia, and converted away from their indigenous lives. And so we have to look beyond that at the current issues land rights of Indigenous people in Australia, in Canada. Look at fundamental levels of discrimination that exist around the world. I was chair of the Dalit Solidarity Network in support of Dalit peoples in not just in India, but in many other parts around the world where there's caste discrimination. And so issues of education, of land rights and land reform. And if we take Australia as an example, what's the average life expectancy of somebody of Aboriginal descent? What's the likelihood of being put in prison? What's the likelihood of underachieving in school, etc., etc.? Ditto in Canada. So these things all have to be understood. Now, Black Lives Matter's movement has been wonderful and brilliant and fascinating in many ways. Sadly, George Floyd wasn't the first person to be killed by the US police, but he was killed in real time on television, and everybody saw it for what it was. And the Black Lives Matter's movement grew massively as a result of that. It is a movement, and it is a global movement. And that movement, people all over the world who are really up against it, saw something of their own lives in this. I remember Alicia Castro on a call a couple of days later describing how people in Argentina related to it because they recognized it was the poor and dispossessed that were being treated so brutally by their forces. And so we have to understand that. That means teaching of history, teaching the real history, global standards on history, if you like, so we understand where knowledge comes from, where wealth comes from, what imperialism has done. But it's also about reparations. I'll just finish on this point because otherwise we'd take up the whole 2 hours on this. If you read a book by a very interesting, wonderful guy called Eric Williams. Eric was the first Prime Minister of independent Trinidad and Tobago in 1962. Before that, he'd been studying in London. He went to the London School of Economics, and he wrote a book, or wrote a PhD thesis called Capitalism and Slavery. Absolutely brilliant piece of work. And in it became a book, Capitalism and Slavery. He points out the enormous wealth of British banks, British sugar companies, etc., 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 all of which came from the Caribbean, mainly Jamaica, because that was the richest place in the British Empire at one stage. And then when my friend, the late, great Bernie Grant, proposed into Parliament in the late 80s, early 90s, a system of reparations, he was condemned, he was ridiculed, he was laughed at. He said, no, you've got to remember where the wealth of this country comes from, and it comes from. So reparations isn't just about returning historic artifacts. Before the program started, Niki and I were discussing the Parthenon marbles, and there's plenty of other
close to my heart as a Greek Canadian.
Indeed, but there's plenty of other examples as well in the Louvre and the Pergamon and so on, and in the British Museum. But it's also about reparations in terms of fair trade, in terms of investment, and in terms of debt forgiveness. The island of Haiti got its independence by a slave uprising in 1792. It got the independence because of the leadership of Toussaint Louverture and others, and the price France extracted was a massive debt, and that debt has gone on and on and on. And so Haiti still remains the poorest place in the Western Hemisphere and the most indebted nation in the Western Hemisphere. And it goes back to those days. So reparations are a combination of things: debt forgiveness, investment, fair trade. David Cameron, somewhere along the line when he was Prime Minister, picked up something about reparations. I don't think he fully studied it or fully understood it. So he went to Jamaica, which I was kind of sort of, I suppose, pleased he went to Jamaica. Good idea, I think. And then he went there and said, we recognize the problems of the past, so we're going to help you. And he offered to build a prison.
Oh, my goodness.
He offered him a prison, a British-built prison for Jamaica. I think the last thing Jamaica needs is another prison.
Yeah.
Jamaica needs a lot of things, but it's not that.
Yeah.
So
speaking of this,
we have to sort of think in terms of that. But your question is superb. But it's also saying to the wider community, as has happened with the left in Australia, that you do have to educate people all across the piece about it to bring them alongside and on board with it. And I think
struggle.
Niki, I'm sure, does that day in, day out in your work as a representative.
And it certainly here it's at the core of you know what I fight for, what so many of us fight for. And I just wanted to highlight a comment from an activist, incredible activist, Paul Taylor, who shared a comment here. Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty are inextricably linked. Among other things, the origins of the modern industrial food system is stolen bodies farming on stolen land. And we're going to hear actually a bit more from Paul a little bit later today. Jeremy, thank you. I want to move to a written question now. We received hundreds of written questions, so we had to go through, and the ones that we picked are actually reflective of the fact that many ask these kinds of questions. And the first
Can we thank
one,
Amy for her question? It's really good. Thank you, Amy.
I'm sure it will mean the world to her, and thank you so much, Jeremy, for your thoughtful answer and your solidarity on the struggles of decolonization. The written question we have on a different topic, but very central to your work as well, is from Kabir. What advice do you have for young activists who are unsure if joining a political party or politics is worthwhile to make progress? So a different note, we have a lot of young people tuned in today that are deeply inspired by your work and the movement you've built, Jeremy. What would you say to so many others out there?
Thanks again for the question, because it is about how we change things in the world. Yes, join political parties, but remember why you're doing it. Remember what you're trying to achieve, because some people join political parties because they think it will give them huge personal advantage, advancement, so on and so on. That is a corruption of the political system. Surely it is about the objectives of the kind of society we want to live in and empowering others. Because I always say to people when I'm doing campaigning, I said, look, if you're really angry about something and you watch the news every night on television, you get really angry and you shout at the television, you might even throw things at the television. It's fine. If you really want to throw things at the television, it's fine. You can do it in the privacy of your own home. It really doesn't bother me very much. But more importantly, it doesn't bother the people on the television either. It doesn't make a blind bit of difference to anything. And so, but if you're in communication with people that think the same way as you, and you get that sense of empowerment from it, and it starts in your community. If your health board, health authority, whatever it is, decides it wants to close a hospital, and you're against that because you need it, and it's public spending cuts and so on. And this is a very familiar story the world over. You get together and you campaign to keep that hospital open, and you win. And it stays open. And the health workers continue doing their wonderful work. Well, you've done two things. You've kept the hospital open, but you've given the most massive piece of political education to thousands of people in that community that they're standing together, defend something that is good, and gives you the chance to move on to develop something new that is even better. And so it is about strength and mobilizing people. Now, you don't win every struggle you go into. You don't win every strike you take. You don't win every demand straight away, but you win it over a long period of time. Example from history, mid-19th century, the Chartists, early 19th to mid-19th century, Chartists in Britain, marched for rights at work, right to vote, accountable parliaments, all those issues. They were ridiculed, they were condemned, the army was set upon them, and their charter was ripped up and Parliament ignored it. And one of the MPs that presented the charter to Parliament, the Great Charter, in I think 1852, was Charles Duncombe, who represented the area I am now in at this very moment. Within 100 years, almost all of their demands, except for annual parliaments, had been met. They probably didn't realize what they were doing at the time and how historic it was going to be, any more than the toll puddle martyrs in southern England who stood up for trade union rights in 1820. They didn't realize what they were achieving, yet they set the setting the scene for the global trade union movement. And so it is about mobilizing people. So take your cause, environment, take your cause, equality, take your cause, economic security, take it into political parties, but don't lose sight of the reason you went and the cause that goes with it. A political party is not an end in itself. It is a means to create a movement which can bring about the better ends that we want.
Terribly inspiring, Jeremy. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that many of us will go on to repeat what you just shared with us, attributed to you. But thank you for sharing that. I want to go back to a key pillar of your work over decades, and certainly you brought it up in the context of peace and justice. Our next video question from Nashwa takes on the issue of media consolidation. Let's go to the question.
Hi, Jeremy Corbyn. My name is Neshwalina Khan, and I'm a writer, community-based researcher, and facilitator living on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, also known as Mississauga, Ontario. I also host and produce a podcast called Habibti Please. As an independent media creator, I want to challenge and counter-story predominant corporate media narratives. This issue is near to my heart, and I know it is to yours too, as one of your first jobs was at a local paper. You care a lot about the media, and they care a lot about you. Media is important. It always has been and always will be. At its worst, media can manufacture consent for coups, war, invasion, dispossession, and so much more brutality. However, at its best, media challenges unaccountable power. Around the world, journalists who have been fearless in this work have been silenced. In tandem with this, we have often witnessed the consolidation of media that oppresses people rather than empowers them. Now more than ever, we need critical voices in the media to proliferate such a landscape. How do we take down corporate media, resist and challenge the consolidation and powers that dominate the news we receive?
Nashwa, thank you for that very profound question. There's a lot to say on this, and I'm conscious that we have a time limit of 2 hours for the whole program, but let me start with a few thoughts.
We have a bit of flexibility after, but yeah.
Okay.
So,
yeah. First of all, I am not condemning or opposed to journalists or journalism. I'm actually a member of the National Union of Journalists, as well as another union, Unison, formerly National Union of Public Employees. So what I say is not to condemn every journalist. There are many incredibly brave journalists around the world. I think of those in Colombia, in Mexico, in India, and Egypt, that have faced imprisonment, that have faced death threats, that indeed have been murdered. And I remember going to a journalist meeting in Mexico. They used to meet together in Mexico City on a Thursday night, and they invited me along. And they'd start off discussing who had been killed that week, which journalists had disappeared. Because that's the reality of what the drug cartels and possibly others were doing to them at the same time. So I think we have to think carefully about that. Secondly, you kindly said that journalists care, the media rather, not journalists, the media cares a great deal about me. They do. And they've shown an incredible interest in everything to do with
even
my life,
here,
which I'm absolutely grateful to them for, totally fascinated by, including great uncles I'd never heard of names I didn't recognize, who allegedly did bad things, but I didn't even know of their existence. But obviously I'm very sorry they did bad things, even though I'd never heard of them. But it was a sort of mad period by journalists. But I'm sort of grateful to the Daily Mail for setting a record of 14 pages of their paper on election day in 2017, condemning me and John McDonnell and Diane Abbott and every other colleague in very strident terms, because that is what they're about. So it is also more seriously the way in which they behave as lickspittles for the establishment. In the run-up to the Iraq War, the British government and the US government were pumping out all this stuff that Iraq was about to set off missiles with weapons of mass destruction in 45 minutes notice, and they had even had concentric rings around Iraq to show where a missile could get to in 45 minutes, who would be at risk, and so on. And this was a reason we had to go to war and bomb Iraq. And so they built this stuff up, and every single national newspaper, with the exception of the Morning Star and to quite a big extent to its credit, the Daily Mirror, challenged this and opposed this. But despite us having more than 1 million people at a rally and 2 million on the streets, Parliament voted eventually to support the government in going to war. Where were the weapons of mass destruction? They didn't exist. They never did exist. And even if they had existed, what was the point of bombing them? Wouldn't it have been better to look for a peaceful solution? I was no supporter of Saddam Hussein. I was no supporter of the human rights abuses in Iraq or anywhere else. But I was no supporter of bombing Iraq. You can't bomb people into democracy. You don't bomb people to gain their human rights. You do it by more intelligent means than that. But they built this whole thing up. And it was the combination of dishonesty, of the media, and of hysteria, and an absurd form of nationalism that led us into that war. And I'm now meeting people in refugee camps from Libya, Jordan, Lebanon, and so on, who are victims of that war. So that's what the media does to you. So where do we take it from here? Our project is very serious about the media. One is to build up the alternative. Two, prevent Rupert Murdoch taking over yet another TV channel in this country. And three, to challenge the system of corporate ownership of our access to social media and the algorithms that go with it. There was a time when we all thought social media was our space, our territory. You go on Twitter, it's fine. And I began sort of seeing strange adverts appearing whenever I went on social media. Why? Why was I continually being told the price of funerals all over Britain? Because when you get to be my age, they think you need a funeral. Don't worry, it's a long way off, a very long way off. Don't worry about that. And so I thought, what's this madness? What's going on? Why do I need to know the price of a funeral in every town I go to? And it's an algorithm that tracks me where I'm traveling and what I might need to do when I get there. There's a bit of a joke at one level, but another side, it's absolutely serious. So they're using social media to tailor the information we get, to tailor the news that we get, to tailor the thought process we get. And all the time, we're laboring under this illusion that we are freely surfing the internet and working out information for ourselves. We're being poked in certain directions all the while. So there has to be accountability in it. Why should we have to rely on 3 or 4 big tech companies in Silicon Valley to decide whether we can communicate with each other or not all around the world? And so it is serious. And I finished just the example of the powers of the internet companies and governments. We did a big call a few weeks back with the Indian farmers, and I spoke in a debate in Parliament about the Indian farmers, and we've had a lot of contact and support with them. Why is it that when they have a big demonstration, when they're being very successful in getting their message across, when 250 million people take strike action across India in support of the Indian farmers, that A, the mainstream media told us basically nothing about it on the global scene. And secondly, internet access was cut off for them during those crucial periods. So that is unaccountable power by big business to stop an unwelcome message of essentially saying there is an alternative to agribusiness running agriculture. There is an alternative, and it's a more sustainable one that goes with it. So we're developing these thoughts, developing these ideas as rapidly as we can, and we need to share each other's platforms all the time. So when Progressive International do a podcast, we'll share it with them, and so on. There's lots of people doing that. And that is a developing way forward. And Niki, I hope that we can share with friends in Canada and the USA and elsewhere as we develop these programs, so that we realize that actually it is quite possible and relatively cheap to be able to share ideas and information. The media is essential to it. Diversity in the media. Again, I go back to this other point. Very few people buy newspapers these days. Whenever I go to a meeting, I do a show of hands saying, you remember the meetings, they used to happen. Say, how many people in this room buy a newspaper? Put your hands up like this, you see. And if it's a meeting of people, predominantly young people under 30, Nobody. If it's 30 to 50 and it's 100 people at the meeting, maybe half a dozen. If it's over 50, quite a lot. If it's over 60, everybody. The purchasing of newspapers is disappearing. So instead, people are relying on what they believe to be free media, but in reality are looking for comfort zones to hear their own information. We have to expose ourselves to other ideas as well. Otherwise, we become very stale.
Well, I want to say, and this is not news to anybody tuned in, but we have the right-wing media to credit for the significant attention our event received, Jeremy. You won't be surprised, unlike the UK, not unlike the UK, the right-wing media here in Canada attacked our event. But as a result of that, we got a lot of free publicity, and here we are today with so many people tuned in and eager to defend the need for these conversations.
Can we send them a message of thanks then?
I think we should.
Send a message. Thanks so much for attacking our event. It's worked fine.
More than fine. But I also do quite want to I want to give a shout out to all of the independent podcasters with whom I did interviews in the weeks leading up to this event. Tremendous voices, including Nashwa and so many others who really pushed this event out and the need for this conversation through their own networks. And we hope to do a lot more of that work. Tied into this
Niki,
question.
Before we move on, can we also just ask everybody on this call, when you get a call to support journalists who've been imprisoned, put on trial, threatened with the death penalty, or threatened with extrajudicial killing through mafia gangs and so on, give them your support, because they are real journalists, really proud people. Assange and others that have told the truth about what's going on around the world deserve our solidarity, not our condemnation, because they are the ones that really are trying to make sure we know what's going on.
Well said. Very much connected to this issue, Jeremy. I want to go to another written question from Jim, who asks, over 73 million people in the US voted for Trump last year. Equivalent numbers voted for extremely right-wing politicians all over the world. Some of those can't be reached. But what is to be done to reach the majority of those that we need to save the planet from extinction?
Good question, because yes, I was watching the US election results, like I'm sure all of you were, and watching the Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer and so on, which was exciting. And I was astonished by the turnout and the vote, but astonished by the fact that Trump got over 70 million votes, highest ever apart from Biden's vote in US history. And that says something, because essentially Trump is what? A right-wing, super wealthy man who has made the right-wing super wealthy even more right-wing and even more wealthy during his period of presidency. The idea he's some kind of popular appeal that's bringing jobs to people and bringing social justice to communities all across the USA is just such nonsense. But nevertheless, he's managed to carry that off to a huge extent. So I think you have to work very hard at bringing communities together. You don't go out and condemn everybody that may have, in my view or your view, mistakenly voted for Trump. You have to try and understand why they voted for Trump. I met a guy in Houston after the election when Trump got elected. And he was in a taxi. I asked him how he voted, and he said he voted for Trump. And I said, well, what'd you do that for? He said, well, I voted for Bernie Sanders before. I said, you what? So you voted for Bernie Sanders, then Trump. I said, they're polar opposites. He said, no, they're all against the establishment. And he got this sort of idea that Trump was some kind of anti-establishment candidate. He's not. Totally part of the establishment. Bernie Sanders is anti-establishment, obviously. So it is a question of reaching out to people. That means union membership. That means union and community activities. And we've got to do our politics differently. It is about organizing in the community. It is about empowering people. It's not about simple electoralism and media attraction. It is about empowerment of people, and that's where you bring people together. No, I think Niki's right. You're not going to win over everybody, but a significant number of those would be. I remember Malcolm X was once asked about how racism would end in the USA and would it ever end? And he said a very interesting thing. I think it was Malcolm X. He said, yeah, racism will end first in Alabama when the sharecroppers and the black community realize they're actually dealing with the same problem and the same power in structures. It'll end last in Massachusetts, where the liberals have never understood it in the first place. And so there's a quite simplistic way of saying things, but it's quite profound that at the end of the day, it's class instincts that will bring people together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I did want to say, you know, many people tuned in, of course, here in Canada are deeply inspired by Bernie Sanders and the movement he built. Pardon me, next door. In fact, I went to campaign for him in the primaries, the first primaries he ran in North Dakota, the state just south of us, also pilloried by the right for doing so. And I encountered very much the same thing. People on the doorstep said, if Bernie doesn't win, I'm voting for Donald Trump. You know, it's a sentiment. We see it very similar here in our own country. So I much, very much appreciate your comment about understanding where people are coming from, but also the recognition and you know, the sense of the need to build solidarity, working class solidarity with marginalized communities to take on the establishment that pushes us all down. So, Jeremy, I want to, the next question touches on one of the themes that you raised at the beginning, one of the biggest challenges of our time, the climate emergency, and ways of tackling it along with broader justice. So I want to turn now to two questions from Emma, Tiffany, Rebecca, and the Green Jobs Oshawa crew.
Hi, Niki and Jeremy. My name is Emma Jackson. I am a climate justice organizer with 350.org, which is an international climate justice organization committed to keeping fossil fuels in the ground. I'm based on Treaty 6 territory in Amiskwaci, Waskahigan, also known as Edmonton, Alberta. And my question for you is, what are your perspectives on a global Green New Deal? Why is it important, and how do we win it? Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Francesca Hannon.
I'm Tiffany Balducci.
And I'm Rebecca Keach. And we are organizers with Green Jobs Oshawa, a grassroots coalition of workers, community leaders, environmentalists, and labor activists. When General Motors announced their intention to end vehicle production in Oshawa, we advocated for placing the GM Oshawa plant under public ownership to repurpose it for socially beneficial manufacturing.
We commissioned a feasibility study that showed that a government-owned facility in Oshawa could create 13,000 jobs, build 150,000 electric vehicles in the first 5 years, and decrease CO2 emissions by 400,000 metric tons. The electric vehicles would be for the public sector, such as postal vehicles, ambulances, and more.
Once the COVID-19 crisis hit, we raised a demand for governments to order General Motors to produce PPE in Oshawa, using the available space and laid off workers. After our campaign and pressure, the Canadian government and GM announced that 50 to 60 workers would be recalled to manufacture surgical masks. The pandemic proves it is possible for the manufacturing industry to shift gears quickly, but leaving this up to corporations alone won't do.
All across the world, people are rejecting capitalism's lie that we have to accept inequality and declining living standards. They understand that the system was constructed to protect the few, and they are demanding that it care for the many. Our question for Jeremy is, how important is it to place public ownership on the public agenda? And why is there power in public ownership?
Incredible question.
So there you have it. Two questions. One more specifically on the Green New Deal, but the other connected to it is the how can we use public ownership? And of course, you've been a great defender of nationalization to get at these goals of economic, social, and environmental justice.
Thanks, and brilliant questions, and thank you for the way that you put them. The way you put them as an education in itself. First of all, on public ownership of key industries and services is absolutely essential in the way forward, so that a progressive government then has the tools in which to deliver the economic strategy they want to deliver. I managed to persuade my party to support public ownership of the water system, of the rail system in its totality, and of the mail network, but also led and inspired by John McDonnell, we also developed a policy of supporting cooperatives, and when a business was going under, giving the workers first refusal on buying it out with government support to do so they'd run the industry. But I was also very clear that this wasn't going to be a 1940s style of nationalization and public ownership, where essentially the government would take it over and would then appoint a board to run it, and it would be run on much the same lines it was run before, and the board would be just as remote. It would just be comprised of people that happen to be mates of the government rather than somebody else. What I wanted was a much more democratic form of public ownership, where you would be using the skill sets of the workers concerned. And I worked very closely with the Communication Workers Union on developing ownership of Royal Mail into People's Post service, which would not just deliver letters, would also take over the running of post offices, because they're a separate organisation in Britain, bizarrely, but would also develop the role of the postal worker within the community, because postal workers are an essential part of it. I also developed a policy of free access to the internet all over the country as a priority to cover the whole country, and I was condemned by the Daily Mail as bringing in broadband communism. I'm still struggling with the concept of what broadband communism is, but apparently it's what I proposed. It's interesting, the government itself is now demanding of the internet companies they provide universal access all over the country. The private sector was never going to do it. It would only be, because they're never going to go to some remote farm up in the north of Manitoba. They're not going to go up into the Rockies and take something to some remote chalet or something. They're not going to do it in the Highlands of Scotland. They're only going to do it in the cities where it's easy. So it's got to be universal, in the same way we demand universal postal service. So public ownership is a very important part of it, and expanding it. We would also proposing a national investment bank with regional investment banks, which would develop industries within the ambit of the environment policy, but above all, the empowerment of the workforce and the skill levels of it. I mean, how many times do you go into a factory and you talk to people working on the machines, you talk to people who are doing the packing, you talk to people who are doing the delivering, they're bubbling with ideas. What turns up? Some bod from finance somewhere who says this factory is not worth anything, let's sell the site. What do they know? What do they know? What's their skill levels? So it is about empowering people. And if we're to win on the Green New Deal, and we are going to win on it, you've also got to recognize we've got to provide people with a degree of security. Now, I've been sort of feeling my way through this whole debate about universal basic income, minimum earnings guarantee, all these areas. Unless we offer to all communities some benefit of the green technologies we're bringing in, then we're not going to get much of a hearing. And so one idea we developed was that where we developed a wind farm on the coast, and Britain has lots of coast and lots of wind, so we were certainly up for that, and indeed they've grown a great deal. We said there has to be a special fund set aside, run by the local community, for community improvements in the seaside towns, so they could see a wind farm being developed off the coast, they get the benefits from it. Fairly obvious stuff in many ways. So it is about that. Now, can we reach an agreement? Yes, it is possible. I went to COP25 in Paris, and It was an absolutely fascinating experience, representation of people from indigenous communities in Bolivia and Peru and other places challenging big business. And we held an evening meeting when was standing room only, absolutely packed out, on ideas surrounding the Green New Deal. Now, the interesting thing about Paris was that all the countries signed up to it. That was important because China, India, USA, Americas, Canada, Britain, and so on, signing up was very important. But there's some big holes in that agreement. Net zero by 2050 is too late. Mm-hmm. Secondly, it didn't really take into account the issues of aircraft emissions, and it didn't take into account the way in which we export pollution. Now, we all feel good when we buy a sustainable piece of cotton, nicely produced. Yeah. Are we aware of the conditions under which it's produced? Mm-hmm. Are we aware of the pollution that's happening in Bangladesh, in Indonesia?
Oh, I think we may have lost Jeremy for a second. I don't know if you can hear us, Jeremy. I think Jeremy's feed is frozen, so maybe we'll let him reconnect and finish that thought. But in the meantime, in fact, what we were going to go to next is a number of messages from folks, some here and around the world, for us here today. So we'll turn to these.
Well, Niki, we lost contact a bit there.
Yes.
I don't know how much you heard of that. I stopped when the screen went blank.
Yes, we caught you at, you were talking about sustainable.
Yeah, sustainable production. And so it is, this in effect becomes the export of pollution. So if we stop emissions from a factory in Toronto, great, lovely. Make the lake clean, make the rivers clean, great, lovely, clean air. But if you've made the air foul in Beijing, in New Delhi, or somewhere else, you haven't actually achieved very much other than transferring the pollution to somebody else. It has to be about global agreements. And that's why watching what the big business does on transferring investments away from highly regulated economies to elsewhere is important. Now, we've been through the whole Brexit experience, and at one stage, we were in negotiation with the British government about the deal and so on. I assumed our talks with the government would break down on workers' rights. They didn't. They broke down on the basis that they were not prepared to guarantee the continuation and extension of the environmental protections that we have in Britain that have come via the European Union, because they wanted to appeal to largely US-owned big business to come and invest in Britain, where there would be lower environmental standards, lower regulations, GM foods, etc., etc. So it is about these international standards, and that's where we can all do something together. So if, through Progressive International, we say we're campaigning on food standards, agricultural working conditions, use of pesticides, use of neonicotinoids, which kill bees, and so on, then those universal campaigns might sound a bit like it's a bit zany, it's a bit one-off. No, it's not. It's absolutely fundamental to what we do together. Mm-hmm. And so it is about working globally, and that we've got to do. So I'm optimistic. We're working with, obviously, lots of environment organizations. We'll be at COP26, which is going to be in Glasgow in Scotland in later this year. And I think it is perfectly possible to achieve a net zero by 2030. If we don't, what are the implications on global warming? What are the implications on global emissions? And so when people blithely talk about increasing trade, if you've got a ship carrying thousands of tons of plastic from China across the Pacific to Canada, or all around to get to Britain, usually through Suez Canal and so on, well, what are the emissions from that? And what's the necessity of it in the first place? It is about local production for need. That is important. And getting the message across to young people that nothing can ever be totally destroyed or thrown away. It ends up somewhere else. If you throw a piece of plastic in the trash can and it's not properly dealt with, it'll end up in a river, it'll end up in a fish, you'll end up eating your own plastic ultimately. It is about recognizing the limits of what we do to the environment. Environment politics is about facts and policies. It's about a state of mind. It's a state of mind towards the environment. And that applies whether you live in I represent the smallest, most urbanized constituency in Britain. Niki represents part of Manitoba, where I've worked out that there are 2 people per square kilometre.
It's the same size as Sweden. That's
exactly
the analogy.
So
yes,
you've got a lot more open space than I have. Just saying.
and very much a vantage point. I mean, of course, climate change is already hitting Western and Northern Canada more. We can already see the implications. But I wanted to go back to your point around the state of mind, Jeremy. I mean, I want to acknowledge the many environmental activists who are tuned in today and thank them for their work, because here in Canada we have quite the fight. We have a prime minister that has very much greenwashed his agenda, right? Justin Trudeau, and of course we're nowhere near meeting our target, but also at the same time he's invested our money, speaking of public ownership, in a pipeline opposed by Indigenous peoples and many across the way. And so for us it's very, very important to push back against that hypocrisy, but also put forward a bold vision like the Green New Deal, and bring in public ownership as part of that. So you heard
you've got to offer people an alternative. Yes, yeah. I'm opposed to the pipeline. You are, quite rightly so. But you've also got to say to those communities that are poor, lack job opportunities, lack education opportunities and everything else, you've got to offer them something in return. You can't just say, you can't have this because it's environmentally bad. I agree. But you've got to come up with something else.
Yeah, and there is so much more there. Jeremy, we have a few moments for you to take a breather by watching some comment videos that have been sent in, including by some people that you know well. So let's turn to that, and we'll reconnect in a few minutes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Hello, this is a message of support
for
my friend and comrade, Canadian MP, Niki Ashton. Niki Ashton, Jeremy Corbyn, our comrades in Team 25, myself, everyone in the Progressive International. We are not going to stop fighting against all forms of racism, with its worst kind, anti-Semitism, at the top of our list of priorities. We stand together with our Jewish comrades, our Palestinian comrades, against all sorts of racism, especially anti-Semitism. And we are never going to allow anyone to accuse Niki Ashton and Jeremy Corbyn of anti-Semitism just in order to silence opposition to Israeli apartheid. Fighting anti-Semitism and fighting all sorts of apartheid are part of the same common struggle.
Thank you, first of all, so much, Jeremy Corbyn and Niki Ashton, for hosting this discussion. It's so needed. I'm Reverend Dr. Sherry DeNovo, recent recipient of the Order of Canada, and I've been so honored to work with activists over many years in political and also religious life. Did the first legalized same-sex marriage, and then we were honored to pass the very first banning conversion therapy bill in Ontario, largest jurisdiction in North America and the first to do that. Also trans rights as human rights, that was back in 2012, again, the very first large jurisdiction in North America to do that, plus the only jurisdiction that I'm aware of anywhere that has a moment of silence legislated for the entire legislature for trans deaths the previous year. So I'm happy to continue with this work of social justice, and I thank you both for your amazing work of social justice every day.
Hi, my name is Dimitri Lascaris, and I'm a lawyer, journalist, and activist from Montreal, Canada. Last year, I had the privilege of running to be the leader of the Green Party of Canada on an explicitly eco-socialist platform. Among other bold policy proposals we championed, we called for a hard limit on wealth accumulation, a maximum spread between executive and worker compensation of 10-1, a 50% reduction in Canada's stratospheric military spending, as well as Canada's withdrawal from NATO, and conferring upon Indigenous communities an absolute veto right over extractive activities on their lands. When we embarked on our campaign, naysayers said our embrace of eco-socialism and radically progressive policies would make us uncompetitive. But in a field of 8 candidates, we finished second, losing on the 8th and final ballot after taking the lead on the 5th. Of course, we were disappointed in the end to lose, but we were greatly encouraged by the widespread support for our eco-socialist platform. My decision to run last year was inspired in no small part by the political courage and moral integrity of people like Jeremy Corbyn, Niki Ashton, and Bernie Sanders. They and other progressive champions have helped lay a strong foundation on which socialists can and must build, but in order to succeed, we on the left must unite. The right has its own divisions, but the right can afford disunity because its unjust policies are widely supported by the ultra-wealthy and the ultra-powerful. Unlike the right, we leftists cannot afford disunity. Our strength lies in our numbers. By uniting, we shall prevail.
Greetings. My name is Chris Ramsroop. I'm an organizer with Justice for Migrant Workers in Toronto, Canada. I want to spend a few minutes talking about plantations, not plantations of the global south, but the plantations of Europe, Canada, and the United States, where agricultural workers continue to be dehumanized and subjected to dangerous conditions because of chemicals, pesticides, unfair working conditions, and the inability and the illegality to form unions. It is time for us to end a system of racial exploitation. It is time to end plantation economies. It's a time to end the power of agricultural industries that are bent on global domination and not providing food that meets our community needs. I'm asking all of us to show solidarity with migrant workers, whether they're undocumented, resident, or guest workers, and to call for status for all and an end to the abuses in the fields across the world. Solidarity, peace, and love.
Hi, everyone. We just wanted to pop in briefly and say how honored and excited we are to support the work of Progressive International as members of the Governing Council. PI is doing incredibly important work building international infrastructure for the left, whether in movement and labor-oriented campaigns like Make Amazon Pay, or the vital work of naming vaccine apartheid for what it is and helping to support that frame, developing policy for a global Green New Deal. This is a moment when internationalism spreading and reigniting is a matter of survival. And we're so grateful and excited to be part of this work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for supporting Progressive International. You know, I've been thinking about the fact that during times of crisis, there is a tendency to turn inwards. And I think a lot of us have experienced that in our personal lives during this pandemic, where our world kind of gets smaller and smaller and just seems to shrink in the face of these huge crises. And I think we also know from our personal experience that that doesn't help, that we are social creatures. We need each other. We need our communities. We need our social movements. It's one of the ironies of our age that despite these incredible tools that allow for global instant connection on multiple platforms any time of day or night, our movements have actually become more inward looking. And that's why I support Progressive International, why I urge you to support it. We are up against transnational global forces, and we need to rebuild progressive internationalism because that's where our strength lies. Our strength lies in connections in our individual lives and also in our movement lives.
Thank you. Have a wonderful event.
So some familiar faces, and pleased that Abby and Naomi, fellow Governing Council members from Canada, were able to be part and show their support, and of course friends of yours like Yanis and who of course you've worked with for a while now, Jeremy. So we some great messages there.
Can I thank them for all those messages? Absolutely fantastic. It is about organizing. It is about unity of the left. It is about understanding economic strategies and policies. And it's also about organizing people to give them some hope. And I thought the message about agricultural workers is absolutely key. Agriculture should not be the most dangerous industry. You should not die from pesticides because you're growing vegetables. You should be able to live and work safely on it. And so it is about our international action. And I think Progressive International organizing international action around Amazon and Amazon work rights is very, very important. And I thank Abby and Naomi for what they just said at the end. Naomi made incredible contribution to helping us when she spoke at the Labour Party conference, and she and I spoke together in Paris in 2015. And the point about the social issues surrounding the pandemic and crisis, at one level, yeah, people did turn in on themselves, and because they're forced to lock down. But lockdown has different meanings for different people. In my community, being locked down in a one-bedroom flat with 3 children and trying to work from home and schools closed and expected to educate your kids as well is a bit tough. I've been helping out with our local food hubs and food banks and so on, and amazing numbers of people who come out to help each other, who never thought they'd need help at all in their lives and never thought they'd be in that position. They've suddenly realized we actually do depend on each other. And so I think there is almost a millennial generation that has had a massive political awakening during this pandemic. It's not exclusive to my country or yours. It's a global thing. People begin to understand they need and rely on each other. And so the international calls for health equality have come out of that. And so let's, moving forward on this, make sure that coming out of it is not an excuse for international austerity, cutting back on public spending, not an excuse for international book balancing, which will hit health, education, and housing programs all over the world. It's a time for sustainable investment for the future. This is our opportunity, our moment to get all these things across. We ain't going to do it if we're disunited. We ain't going to do it if we're kowtowing to the banks and biggest businesses. We're only going to do it if we're bold and we're confident and assertive of what we can achieve. And so the way Naomi put it, and Abby put it, and the others put it, fantastic. And Yanis, well, I speak to Yanis very often. We do lots of Zooms.
That's where we're at, and great to have some leading progressive voices, Sherry, Dimitri, and Chris, and we're going to hear from some other folks a bit later in the program as well. You're absolutely right, Jeremy. I mean, this is something that so many of us are hungry for here, a bold vision for the world, for a better world coming out of this crisis. In fact, our next questions focus on the question of economic justice, and we'll get to them right now.
Hello, my name is Alex Grant and I'm with Fightback, www.marxist.ca. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you on standing up to the slander and not capitulating and shutting down this event. That's exactly what we need to do to fight back. Anyway, I'd like to ask you whether you agree with me that in the pandemic, what we have seen is not a crisis of neoliberalism, but a crisis of capitalism, that there is no good type of capitalism, and production for profit in all its forms has totally failed. And what we need is a socialist society, a socialist economy. We need nationalisation and democratic workers' control.
Taylor, and I'm the Executive Director of Food Share Toronto, a food justice organisation in the city of Toronto. That's my current job title, but the experience that shaped me the most was the poverty and food insecurity that I experienced as a child. In fact, as a kid, I went on long walks at lunchtime to hide the fact that I didn't have food to eat. I didn't want any of my friends or my teachers to know that we were poor. This is the awful reality for far too many people. It's especially insulting because countries like Canada and the UK signed and ratified the International Covenant on the Right to Food. What, in your opinion, can be done to begin to progressively realize the right to food, both domestically and internationally?
Thanks for those questions. Neoliberalism is an advanced form of capitalism which developed Reaganomics, 1970s, was experimented on with the most incredible levels of brutality in Chile by the Chicago School of Economists in 1976, led to the idea that big business knows best, and the state should basically facilitate big business, and in its international relations should force countries to accept in levels of debt, restructuring, and so on. And the structural adjustment programs pursued by the World Bank and the IMF in the 1970s and 1980s did devastating effect on African economies and Latin American economies at the same time. They led to the shanty towns. They led to the charging for schools. They led to the closure of hospitals. Utterly brutal what they were doing, all in the name of some kind of fake book balancing exercise. But the issue is essentially what our society is about. If we believe in socialism, which I do, then you produce for need, not profit, and you work on a principle that everybody in society matters. We don't leave people behind. So if you work on that principle, in education, in health, in housing, and everything else, you've suddenly got a very different set of demands. Now, people, when I'm campaigning in elections locally, in my own community and everywhere else in the country for that matter, say, Mr. Corbyn, that's all very well, but this socialism you're talking about, what's it going to be like? Will I be told what to do by the state all the time? Will I have a uniformed man outside my house telling me how to think? I said, no. Why would we? We want you to think for yourself. And then they say, well, tell me where it works. I remember one family saying this to me just almost on the close of voting time. They were iffy about whether to vote or not. And they said, well, this stuff, how's it going to work? Where does it work? I said, have you got a doctor? They said, yeah, of course we have. I said, have you got a hospital? I said, yeah, we have. Same one you go to. I said, yeah, okay. And how much did you pay last time you went to see the doctor? They said, what are you talking about? It's free. I said, yes. And why is that? I said, I don't know. I said, it's because socialists wanted a free health service available for everybody at the time they need it, not at the time they can afford it. That is socialism in action. It's simple, it's straightforward, and it's absolutely incontrovertible and true. And I think the question about the way in which the pandemic has exposed things is huge and massive. Look at the role of Big Pharma in all of this. Now, the pandemic starts, a novel virus is discovered, that novel virus spreads, the World Health Organization declare it an epidemic, then a pandemic. And they say something has got to be done about it, so they propose testing, tracing, etc. And they also say massive research has got to be done straight away into developing a vaccine. The vaccines have been developed in different countries, in Britain, in France, and everywhere, all around the world. They've been developed, usually with a massive amount of public investment or tax write-offs to the companies that have done it. Yet the patents are all owned by Big Pharma. I'm part of this campaign, I'm sure Niki is as well, to saying all those patents should now revert to the World Health Organization, not to anybody else. So we have universal access to these vaccines, and the companies should be paid for what they produce, not the fact that they own the patent of it. South Africa fought a massive campaign over antiretroviral drugs to get them at generic prices rather than the prices being ordained by US Big Pharma. And so Big Pharma has got a lot to answer for in all of this. And so I think that is an example of the way we can bring about the socialist ideas. I kind of upset Big Pharma because I proposed in our manifesto at the last election that we would set up a generic drug production company, publicly owned and publicly run, to supply our National Health Service and, of course, other health services around the world so that we could produce them. And I was involved in campaigns on Akambi and a number of other specialist medicines that are incredibly expensive. They're very good, but incredibly expensive. And so socialism means you share the value of it. You don't give it just to the rich who can afford it or the rich countries who can afford it. Why is it that the vaccine is relatively freely available here, half the population has already been vaccinated. There are countries in Africa that haven't had anybody vaccinated yet and not likely to for another year or maybe longer. That's not right, not necessary. So moving on quickly on the right to food, because it's fundamental, really, isn't it, the right to food? Now, it's very strange. In Western societies, we waste a phenomenal amount of food. We put a huge amount of effort into running food banks for the poorest people. And many people are undernourished, malnourished, or going hungry. So we've got food overproduction, food underconsumption by the poorest, and food waste by the richest. It's a crazy setup. Utterly crazy. So we're producing food for waste, knowing that people are going hungry. And so it is about control of agricultural markets, which I go back to, we were talking about earlier. The Indian farmers' dispute is with their government for taking away or threatening to take away the floor price for their production and handing it over to what would become subsidized imports from the USA of maize and other things to undermine that market, as has happened in many African countries. So it is about the right to food and also the right to land. And trade arrangements like the North American Free Trade Alliance between Canada, USA, and Mexico, I'm not sure how many small farmers in Mexico have benefited from that. I suspect none at all, any more than small producers, organic farms and so on have done very well out of this. No, they have not. It's been an open sesame to the biggest businesses. That's what these trade agreements usually are.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and Paul and so many others during this pandemic have been turning to community to find collective solutions, right, for the challenges that people face, and certainly it's we need to connect that with bold national vision and international vision around food justice and beyond. And I was going
understanding, if I may say so, Niki, what food production is about, because at one level you can put lots of chemicals on the ground and you get at one level a massive return of wheat, barley, maize, or whatever it is, but you actually end up with soil degradation, and therefore you put more and more grow fast chemicals on, you decrease the biodiversity, you end up with very poor soil at the end of it. And that is a phenomena not just in Europe and the USA and Canada, it's all over the world. So it is understanding the limits of what you can do and how sustainability can be encouraged.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I was going to go back to your point around the issue of vaccinations. Well, first, your proposal on a generic drug company. That's something that I know when we ran for leader, we proposed that as well with tremendous support behind it. But fast forwarding a number of years later to this pandemic, our vulnerabilities here in Canada have been exposed on a number of fronts with respect to healthcare and our response to the pandemic directly, so much so that it's been identified that we have no capacity to, as it stands, to produce the number of vaccines that we need, and Canada ranks very low, much lower than countries sort of as wealthy as ours when it comes to delivering vaccines to its people. We're far behind many other countries, including the US and the UK, and much of that is connected with our lack of capacity, the privatization that took place of a major laboratory that did and could have done this work decades ago, and essentially we're paying the price now of privatization and lack of socialist vision when it comes to healthcare and including vaccine production. So it's a sad state of affairs, and we've certainly been pushing on our end for bold leadership on this front, and we will continue to do so. Connected to the issue of how do we push for change, Jeremy, and this has been really such an admirable piece of the way you've done your politics. I mean, not just your bold ideas, but the movement you've built around these ideas. So many of us would love to learn. How can we learn from that? What kind of work do we need to do on the ground to put that vision forward, to build momentum, if I can use that word, behind it? And our next question comes from an activist, Sam, that touches on this very issue. So let's get to that question, and would love to hear your answer.
Hi, Jeremy, Niki. Thank you so much for having this event. And my question to you both relates to pushing for bold policy within our respective movements. Jeremy, the movement that brought you to power, Momentum, was successful in pushing labor to the left and galvanizing members and bridging social movements and electoral-based political movements. I suppose my question is, how were you able to build this movement and galvanize members? And how can we do this here in Canada, within our party and outside our party? How can we make our party, the NEP, a party that works to bridge the gap between social movements and electoral politics? How can we work to get those who have been traditionally, oftentimes purposefully excluded from the political process, brought into our party and make our party their political home?
Do you want to answer first, Niki, or shall I?
Well, we're all ready to take notes for what you're going to say, Jeremy. I mean, I certainly have some thoughts, but truly,
Okay.
so many of us been deeply inspired by your work, by Momentum's work, and we'd love to hear your advice.
Thanks, Sam, for your question and the way in which you put it. There are many campaigns and organisations that I've worked with and still do work with in this country. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, the Stop the War Coalition, which has been very good at mobilising very large numbers of people, and within the Labour movement, Momentum, and others. When we questioned the direction of the Labour Party in 2015 after we had lost that general election, when we were proposing to freeze public sector wages and a few other things, which very surprisingly wasn't very popular with public sector workers. I argued, as did many others, that we had to do something, putting up an alternative. People said, look, you won't get anywhere because New Labour has got a stranglehold on the party and, you won't get anywhere. And so we said, no, you've got to give it a go. So we managed with great difficulty to get enough MPs, because that was then the requirement, to nominate me to put me on the ballot paper. We didn't have any organisation. We didn't have any money. All we had was my credit card, and that lasted a week. And then we were out of cash at that point. But we just went out on the road with street meetings all over the country and set up an organisation from that. And by the end of it, we had 17,000 volunteers helping us. Momentum was founded from that. And we crucially got the support of a number of unions, particularly Unite, Communication Workers Union, and the transport unions were very, very supportive, and the wonderful people in the Bakers Union. So though that union support helped a great deal, and we brought people into the party and brought people into policy development. The areas that we struggled with was how to cope with the enthusiasm for new ideas and simply process the ideas that were coming in to put them into a coherent policy form. But that's a good problem to have, actually, when you've got that sort of bubbling enthusiasm. And that's why we developed a National Education Service idea, ending charges at all levels for all education. The words I used were cradle to grave, free education, particularly adult education, as well as, and ending testing in the schools, in primary schools, and also a pupil arts premium, so every child could learn a musical instrument and art education in school, ring fenced, so that we made sure it was spent on that, because I do believe in the creativity of all children is very important to do. So we developed all of these policies, Green New Deal and so on, and that brought people with us. Where did we have problems? We had problems with the media attacks. We had problems within the structure of our own party, and well, it's all publicly on the record. I had massive opposition within the Parliamentary Labour Party, because when I was elected, whilst 35 had nominated me for leader, about half of those didn't really support me, but said they would nominate me on the basis that they thought I had a right to run as a candidate. So in reality, I became the leader of the party with the support of about 7% of the parliamentary caucus. So it was quite a difficult gig, to put it mildly. My way of dealing with it, our way of dealing with it, was to go out there and do it. So I spent 3 days of every week on the road around the country, doing rallies, meetings, discussion groups, and to develop things. It's empowering people. So we had Green New Deal roundtables in every town. We had economic justice case. So it was all about empowering people. So building a movement is important. Now, I'm not the leader of the party now. We wanted to set up the Project for Peace and Justice as a way of, it's not retro, it's not looking back, it's looking forward. It's about empowering people, working globally, internationally, as well as all across the country on the policy areas that I put forward. And when we launched this, we had 500,000 people watch the launch. We've had tens of thousands signed up for it, and we're obviously very busy on organising all kinds of events. We're involved with a campaign against the police bill, which is a particularly repressive piece of legislation been pushed through in Britain at the present time after the terrible murder of this young woman, Sarah Everard, in London last week. But it's also about connecting people globally. So on the call, I do urge people to recognise the value and the work of Progressive International, because supporting and signing up to and being involved with Progressive International means that we can instantly send messages of support to our friends in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Chile, in India, and many other places. And we then realize that we're all actually fighting much the same kind of battle. So that when you need support for something you're doing in Western Canada or all across Canada, we're here for you. And I know you're here for us when we're fighting against stuff in this country. And so that gives people that degree of confidence, and it's confidence that we need in our own abilities and our own movement, confidence in our ideas, because we're ground down by the idea of economic traditions, economic austerity, the balancing the books approach. Government is not a limited liability company. It's not a PLC. Government at its best is about governing for all of the people, but in reality, governments don't govern for all the people. They might be forced into a welfare state. They might be forced into some services, but it is about liberating the mind. My idea of socialism is that it expands the mind, the opportunity, but the principle is you ignore nobody. I don't want to live in a society where my fellow citizens rely on a food bank or begging on the streets in order just to survive and get a night shelter. I want to live in a society where nobody's forced to beg, nobody's hungry. And it's quite possible.
Absolutely, Jeremy. And I know so many of us agree with you on this. And I did want to say you put the shout out for Progressive International's work. I also want to encourage folks watching, this is only the beginning. We'll be doing so much more. And I do want to encourage folks to consider continuing to donate, perhaps on a monthly basis, as a way of supporting Progressive International's work, including more work that we want to do here in the Americas. Our next question actually connects with what you were just talking about, Jeremy, and confidence, having the courage of our convictions. One of the things that deeply inspires me about your leadership, about your activism, is the way in which you have stood up to so much hate and attacks, and persevered in fighting for your principles and standing for people on the margins, and standing in solidarity with so many when it comes to struggles for liberation around the world. We have a question from a young activist here in our country who has a question very much about that, a written question, and I'll read it out. Mel asks, can you speak to gathering up your courage to say bold and important things out loud? I am a transgender student learning about social work. Sometimes I worry about my safety living in Saskatchewan, but I know there are things I have to say. How can I strengthen myself for inevitable pushback and personal attacks?
You're frightened, and it's tough when you're living on your own and scared to go out and say what your identity is. The only thing I can say is, firstly, be what you are and be proud of what you are. And secondly, reach out to people, because often the most surprising people will actually be very supportive and very much in concert with you. Sometimes you think everybody's against you. Can I give you a little example of a local thing 40 years ago I got involved with. I was a councillor, newly elected to the local authority, and a group of squatters had set up what they called the North London Gay Centre in an empty house in the ward that I represented. I got on very well with them. They were fine. They were good friends and got on fine. Then the neo-fascist, no, not neo-fascist, the fascist National Front turned up and started trying to picket the place and trying to sort of basically close it down and abuse the individuals who were living there. And the people in the house were quite frightened of what the local community thought of them, because this was sort of 1970s. The world was quite a different place then. And what happened was the local Irish community, no friends of the National Front at all, who were pursuing anti-Irish racism as well as anti-black racism within the community, they came out and supported the gay community in that place. They said, hang on, they're having a go at you, they're having a go at us, that we're not having it for either of us. And it was a very practical form of solidarity. Nobody would have expected that before it actually happened. So be strong, but also reach out to other people, because you'd be surprised that a lot of people certainly recognize that to live happily, you've got to be comfortable with yourself. And you, therefore, your identity shouldn't be something that is hidden. And so it is about us in solidarity with others and showing real respect and space for each other and not being judgmental all the time.
Jeremy, if I can ask you, as what do you do? What have you done when it seems like so many, certainly in the media and others, including in your own party, have stood against you? How do you get through it?
I laugh at them. You have to have a sense of humour. Because when I used to come out of the house and there's like 30 or 40 journalists all screaming questions at me, I always just said, it's wonderful to see you all. Thank you so much for taking so much time to come and trouble the people in my street and me. Good morning. Then go on your way. And because you can't engage with all these people all the time, but you also have to believe in what you're doing. So if you believe that we can create a fair, sustainable world, we can create peace, we can bring about better justice around the world, then you've got some confidence in what you do. If your politics is all designed around triangulation, you naff off group A here, you please group B there, group C will therefore come on board because they don't like A and they don't think about B. In the same way that you kind of deal with abuse. Now, at one level, if politicians are rude to each other, it's good entertainment. It makes for good media. So if Niki and I are attacked in our respective parliaments and we reply in same kind of language and same kind of terms, to begin with, it's quite funny. Yeah, Niki gave it back to him. Jezza said the right thing there. By the time you've got to the third piece of interchange and rebuttal, the public outside have completely forgotten what you're actually arguing about, and you just look like what you are, a few adults who ought to know better, hurling abuse at each other. Mm-hmm. You're not actually convincing or converting anybody to anything. So it is about your own demeanor and how you behave. But yeah, I mean, I've had a bit of abuse over the years for sure, but so what? It's one of those things. And I'm in a position where I can say things and speak out, others are not. That's why I want to empower people to be able to speak out for themselves. But it's also important to recognize in any movement that when people are under attack, you don't have to join in. You can actually support them instead. And so when Niki's under attack, which I know she is quite often, join in and support her. Don't join in the attack against her, because she's doing it for all the right reasons. She's doing it to empower all of us.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Your words are an honor, and please know that so many of us support you. And I can certainly say, on my end, I've gained immeasurable strength. From the communities that I represent that are marginalized and still fighting, from working people that are taking on the corporations in our region, from young people who are envisioning a bold new future, right? And I think of them, and I appreciate your point on having a sense of humor. I think I'll have to look more into that. But your words are a source of inspiration for us and many, and there are many of us, right? So we will keep going. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Jeremy, we're getting towards the end of our discussion. Not quite there yet. I certainly, and I'm sad to say it, but the next topic is one that we all know is very close to your heart, around international solidarity, struggles with people who have been oppressed around the world, something that you've dedicated your life to, and so I want to turn to a couple of questions from brilliant voices on this front, Tamara and Dahlia.
Hi, my name is Tamara Hansen, and I'm the coordinator of Vancouver Communities in Solidarity with Cuba and an executive member of the Canadian Network on Cuba. Congratulations to Progressive International for organizing this fundraiser and working to overcome fragmentation on the left in favor of building a better world. It is important to me that this organization is working to support activists and organizations fighting inhuman sanctions around the world. My question is, how can the Progressive International support the worldwide campaign against the unjust U.S. blockade on Cuba and hopefully make 2021 the final year of this immoral U.S.
Hi everyone, my name is Dahlia Al-Mazri and I'm a Palestinian journalist and organizer living on the traditional territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations, currently known as Vancouver, Canada. This video is a message to Jeremy, acknowledging his life's dedication to unpopular issues and his moral consistency. From protesting South African apartheid very early on in his career, supporting anti-war movements, to advocating for Palestinian liberation and more. Jeremy has faced countless smear campaigns, as well as our very own Niki Ashton, solely for their progressive beliefs that fight for the freedom and dignity of everyone, the freedom to live, to eat, and breathe without struggle. These beliefs that within the status quo, Jeremy has challenged and remained solid in his positioning, regardless of the hate he has received. Even with all the smears, thousands globally have remained in support of Jeremy Corbyn's fight for a safer world, just like Niki has in Canada, a place that silences Palestinians and attacks allies who call for equality. And lastly, to Jeremy, how can we strengthen our positioning as an intersectional fight for social struggles, from Palestine to Indigenous and Black liberation, and to creating a unison between the oppressed and the marginalized?
Thank you. Very profound questions on which to end. First of all, doing one at a time. On Cuba, the blockade of Cuba is wrong and it's immoral, and it has gone on now since basically 1960, 61 or thereabouts, ever since the failure of the American attempt to land in Cuba in 1961 on the Bay of Pigs. And so the island has been under siege ever since then. I've been to Cuba 3 times, and really interesting, fascinating place to visit, and fascinating and actually very open discussions with people in villages and towns and so on. I've cycled all around Cuba with my eldest son, Ben. And the blockade of Cuba has obviously affected what goes on in Cuba, and they went through the special period after the collapse of the Soviet economy, yet they survived all of that. And it's also spawned the Helms-Burton Act, which has given the USA the power to control what any company does. And so you've got a completely skewed sense of priorities, where a British bank is nervous about doing anything to do with Cuba because they might get a sanction for what they do in the US, and the US is obviously a bigger market than Cuba, and so it goes on. But what's the problem with Cuba? problem surely is the threat of an example. Cuba has a very good healthcare system, has universal and free education, has generally very good housing system and housing policy. It's the threat of example that they don't want with Cuba. Cuban people deserve to be able to live in peace, deserve to be able to be respected and travel just like anybody else. And so the idea of sanctions against Cuba has really got to come to an end. How the Cuban people decide to run their country and live their lives in the future is surely a decision for the Cuban people, not for the government of the United States. And that is really what it comes down to. And I was pleased when President Obama decided to visit Cuba. I thought that was a good move. I hope that former Vice President, now President Biden, will recognize the importance of that and do exactly the same. And I've, as I've said, visited Cuba, and I've been also part of the solidarity campaign with Cuba, and also recognized, and I nominated the Cuban doctors for a Nobel Peace Prize because they turn up. They turn up everywhere.
We wanted them here in Canada.
They don't care what the government is, what the situation is. When there's a problem, they go. The earthquake in Pakistan, they're there. Tsunami in Indonesia, they go. Everywhere they turn up. And I thought during the lockdown period, when there was that huge growth in corona deaths in Italy, who turns up at the airport? Cuban doctors with a massive crowd. There really shouldn't have been a massive crowd because they're supposed to be social distancing, but okay. They're all cheering them, cheering the arrival of the Cuban doctors, who seem to be rather more efficient than many others in getting there to give people help. So let's thank them and recognize them. On the second point that was made by Dilma from Palestine, first of all, thank you for what you said and welcome. I want to see peace in the Middle East. I want to see peace all around the world. And you achieve peace by recognition of the rights of people. So the Palestinian people should not be living under occupation. They should not be threatened with annexation. They should not be stuck in refugee camps. They should be able to lead their lives. And it's been my privilege on 9 occasions to visit both Israel and Palestine and meet wonderful people, human rights campaigners in Israel, human rights campaigners in Palestine, and to visit the Bedouin and many others, as well as to be an election observer in Gaza at the last presidential elections. But the occupation must end. The settlement policy must end. The annexation idea must end. The rights of Palestinian people and that wonderful cultural and literature tradition that they have is something that to me is very important and very precious. And I've been on conference calls with left parties and people in Israel who would agree with all of that, and indeed joined in the campaign against the annexation plan. And your points about Black liberation and Indigenous peoples around the world. Yes, there are many campaigns. Some of them seem very distant and very odd, but you have to remember to support people. So I have been involved with campaigns to support the Chagos Islanders in the British Indian Ocean territories, which have now won their right to decide their own future, i.e. to be part of the Mauritian administration at the UN. Britain is in breach of international law with its continued control of those, just as I've supported the people of the Western Sahara, wrongly occupied at the end of the colonial presence in the Western Sahara in 1975. And there are many such others. Now, these might all seem a bit niche and a bit obscure, but if we can support people that are going through a really difficult time, however difficult and isolated their situation is, they're strengthened. Above all, we're strengthened by that experience. And so it is about land rights. Land rights are very important and crucial to this. It is about cultural rights, the right to speak your own language, the right to your own artistic heritage, and so on. We can learn so much from each other. Every invention in the world didn't come from Europe or the USA or Canada. It came from China, it came from Zimbabwe, it came from South Africa, it came from Latin America, it came from all over. We have a shared and wonderful and rich history. Let's be happy for that and enjoy it. Let's not destroy it.
Well said, Jeremy, and thank you so much for being a leading voice. I did want to there was another question that written, well, it was a submission from Aza Rajbi connected to this issue that spoke to the West's continuous push of unjust wars, and Aza pointed to the war on Yemen. And of course, here in Canada, we are complicit. Our government continues to approve the sale of arms made in Canada to the Saudi regime, something that so many activists are involved in taking on. I also want to acknowledge the many peace activists that are logged in today, and many of whom are well aware of your stand in the UK just recently on against nuclear arms, and the comments that Boris Johnson made, or the commitment that Boris Johnson made. I'm wondering if you could share some thoughts on the struggle for peace.
Very quickly, yes, because I know we're coming up against time. Obviously, we all want to live in a world of peace, otherwise we wouldn't be on this call. Arms sales and wars do go together. And so the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia in massive numbers, going back to the Ali Nomani contract many years ago, which Blair signed, as well as more recent ones. The sale of arms to Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region is absolutely massive, by Britain, USA, some from Canada and other places. And those arms end up killing people in Yemen. Britain also provides aid to Yemen. So it's kind of crazy situation where we provide the wherewithal to bomb Yemen, and then we send in the medics to try and help people who've suffered because of the bombing. Children in Yemen are dying of cholera, a wholly, totally and completely preventable disease. Why are they dying from cholera? Because of their poverty, because of the bombardment of public health facilities, the destruction of hospitals, lack of clean water, lack of proper sanitation and drainage. They're dying. Children are dying of cholera as a result of it. And what are we doing? Still selling arms to Saudi Arabia and pretending it's all okay. It's not okay. It's got to stop. And there has to be a comprehensive approach to a peace policy for the whole region. That means not encouraging a war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I've got human rights questions for every government in that region, every single one of them. And I will ask those questions and demand those questions. But none of them, those human rights abuses, are going to be dealt with by encouraging a war. The only way is going to be a dialogue with Iran, the ending of arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the support for the people of Yemen to bring about their own self-determined peaceful future, just as much as what I've said about the rights of the Palestinian people. Surely that has to be the right way forward on it. If we're just going to arm the place and go to war the whole time, then it ends up making us as brutal as the people that we're allegedly supposed to be dealing with. No, it has to be a future of peace. It's peace education as well as arms conversion policy. And I'll finish on this point. When we propose dramatic changes, as we've done with the environment, as we do with arms sales and nuclear weapons, let's not threaten the communities in our own countries where people work in those industries. Guarantee them support and convert their operations, because our enemies are not the people who work in those industries. Our enemies are the shadowy lobbyists, thought process, living in tax havens and tax exiles, behind stainless steel and glass buildings that you never hear about and never see. They're the ones that are coining it in from all of these operations. So it's up to us in Progressive International and around the world. It's also up to us to support each other. So when we're up against it, let's support each other. And I say a big thank you to my wife Laura and my family for their support to me over the past 5 years, because there's been times when people have had a go at me. So thanks for your support as well, comrades.
Jeremy, and we thank your family. Most importantly, we thank you. Jeremy, we just have a few moments of messages of support in the end. And if you can hang on, and we'll do a quick wrap up after. We'll go to those messages right away.
Very nice one. Is Lily here?
Hi, I'm Krishna Saravanamuthu. I'm a community organizer and journalist in Toronto, and I'm a member of the Spring Socialist Network. I'm happy to support the event by Progressive International, featuring a conversation between Niki Ashton and Jeremy Corbyn. The virus does not respect borders, and neither does the pandemic of racism, xenophobia, and ecological injustice. We are in the midst of a moment where we are seeing a renewed openness to radical visions of freedom, a new wave of regular people just like you and I, the working class, the oppressed, the poor, people who are clear that the solutions to our collective problems demand a change in our political and economic system. At the core of a socialist vision is the simple but profound idea that our liberation is tied to working class people everywhere. We will always have much more in common with each other than with the ruling class of wherever we may end up calling our homes.
Hi, Niki. Hi, Jeremy. Hi, everybody that's tuning in. My name is Nora Loretto. I'm the co-host of Sandy and Nora Talk Politics, and I'm a writer and an activist based in Quebec City. And I've just finished my 340th night of tracking deaths in residential care in Canada because of COVID-19. This event is so important because it brings together progressive people from Canada to hear about what's happening in the rest of the world. And the point of the Progressive International is to do just that. During this pandemic, it's felt very hopeless. It's felt like we were alone, and social isolation and social distancing has, of course, made us be more alone than many have been in our entire lives. And what we can learn from what's happening in other countries around the world, how we can extend our solidarity to other countries around the world is so important. So thank you for putting on this event, and I look forward to the struggle ahead.
Hi, I'm Jason Rockwell, talking to you from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And I wanted to speak today about my experiences working in international solidarity projects or efforts throughout the Western world. I've worked in 3 countries, 17 states in the US, and done some limited door knocking and volunteering for Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. I worked on President Barack Obama's campaign in 2008 in Richmond, Virginia, and have been on several active union organizing drives and political campaigns in the United States, across Canada, and in the UK. I've appreciated Jeremy and Niki's approach, and I hope to learn a lot from them throughout the course of this conference. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jen Prosser, and I am here in Lethbridge, Alberta, on Treaty 7 territory, Blackfoot land. I'm a community organizer here in my city, and I've seen how the pandemic has laid bare the impact and the devastation of austerity economics and neoliberal politics. Without mutual aid and local community organizing, many of our community members, our friends, our neighbors, wouldn't have been able to meet their needs during the pandemic because of the failure of governments to act to serve whole communities. The continuation of putting profits over people and selling out workers in order to make corporate profiteers even more rich is unacceptable. And I'm so inspired by the work Progressive International is doing to support local organizing, support local community leaders, and to raise the alarm on the climate crisis and the neoliberal austerity agenda that is hurting our communities here in Canada and all around the world. Thank you.
Hi, this is Jessie McLean, sending a message of solidarity from Sutton, Ontario, Canada. I just want to take a moment to thank Jeremy, Niki, and the team at Progressive International for doing all the work that you do to build international working class solidarity. During times like this, that work is critical. We see nationalist sentiments on the rise and leaders looking inward, selling an us versus them narrative. And it's critical that these messages don't go unchallenged. So I appreciate the work that you do and the time that you took to join us today to talk about doing all that crucial work. So thank you so much. Continue to push left. This is no time to yield or to compromise. We need radical change, and we're not going to do it without work like this. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
My name is Pavel Vargan, and I'm the coordinator of the Secretariat of the Progressive International. For me, internationalism is not just a way of seeing the world, an awareness of crises and struggles happening beyond one's borders. It is a rich political tradition, grounded firstly in the recognition that your struggle is intimately connected with my struggle. and that your freedom is bound up with mine. And more importantly, it is an unshakable commitment to work for and on behalf of the emancipation of someone you maybe never met. In his lecture, The Myth of the Clash of Civilizations, Palestinian intellectual Edward Said put it well. It seems to me, he said, that unless we emphasize and maximize a spirit of cooperation and humanistic exchange, a profound existential commitment and labor on behalf of the other, we are going to end up superficially and stridently banging the drum for our culture in opposition to all the others. That commitment, that existential commitment, as I see it, is the mission of the Progressive International: to recognize shared struggle and to work tirelessly for its realization through shared actions with the power to win a new world.
There you have it, Jeremy. You've first heard from some leading activist voices for change here in our country, good friends, and as well, of course, from Pavel from Progressive International. Jeremy, I cannot tell you how inspiring these 2 hours and 3 minutes have been. I know so many of us have looked forward to this event. You've given us wisdom, guidance, strength, and most importantly, solidarity. This is only the beginning for the work that I know we hope to do with you through Peace and Justice, and especially through Progressive International. We didn't have a chance to get into your work in Bolivia overseeing the election, but certainly I know so many of us progressives here in Canada want to do more to provide solidarity for people's movements in the Americas, people's movements that are our very own government and many interests here in our own country seek to push down. We thank you and so many others that stand with you in supporting these movements, in supporting change in your own country, and having the courage of your convictions day in and day out. This conversation has given me hope. I know has given many of us hope. I want to acknowledge the many people that tuned in with thoughtful comments, supportive comments. I want to acknowledge as well many from the disability rights community as well, who've tuned in and talked about the need to have justice for people living with disabilities, something that's become even more urgent coming out of this pandemic. Thank you for connecting. Thank you for sharing your thoughts to everybody who tuned in. Please stay in touch about the work that we can do with Progressive International, building solidarity here at home. And finally, Jeremy, thank you for that vision of that sharing your vision for change, for transformative change, for justice, racial, social, environmental, and economic justice. And as you say, for the many, not the few. Thank you so much,
Can I give
Jeremy.
you one line to finish?
Yes.
Pablo Neruda. You can cut off all the flowers, but you can't stop the coming of spring.
Yeah, apt as we move into spring, and I think the spring, an emergence of a hunger and an energy to change the world around us, to tackle the injustice around us. Thank you for that line, Jeremy. Thank you for all the lines. And we look forward to being in touch, to supporting your work. And everybody, please stay tuned to PI's work. Please consider supporting going forward. We will be in touch. Please take care of yourselves in these times. It's a source of strength to know that we all, so many of us, stand together. Thank you.
Thanks, Niki.
Goodbye.